Wandering into the town of Nain, Jesus meets a woman who is at a dead end, a trauma that makes her as good as dead. Well, she might as well have been dead. She's a widow, a woman alone, vulnerable. In the Bible, widow is code for a person on the bottom, a person who cannot make it alone. She had a son. He undoubtedly supported her, protected her. But see them bringing the body of her son out of town for burial. The mourners weep, and surely they are weeping not only for the dead man, but also for the widow. The next funeral in town, well, it could be hers. Despite all the uproar of the resurrection, that Easter, down deep, we may have suspected that nothing about our time had fundamentally changed. Caesar's minions who arrested Jesus and then tortured him to death, they still seem to be securely in charge. We're still having funerals, even after Easter. All those old distinctions, male, female, rich, poor, young, old, they're still in place. So we brush ourselves off after the Easter hoopla. We take a few Sundays for things to get back to normal. We regain our composure. We continue on our trek, our life journeys that end in death. Go ahead, set your goals, work hard, accumulate your stuff, build your walls to give you some modicum of security. But at the end, there awaits grinning, ultimately victorious death. And not only at the end, all along life's way, there are little deaths, lesser funerals. Some of our most painful dead ends come before the end. Well, sickness, for instance, has been called a dress rehearsal for death, an intimation of that time when we will be cut off from the land of the living, isolated, alone, confined. After long illness, when we at last get better, we're often still shaken by the experience, having had a taste of that day when we shall be confined not to a bed, but to a coffin. There's a phone call late one night, or the boss calls you in and tells you that you and your company have come to an end. Or you get that letter that tells you, congratulations, you're accepted. No, it says, we regret to inform you that a friend of mine is in his 80s. He's enjoyed good health most of his life. I was congratulating him on his spry disposition. He replied, well, thanks, but I've seen enough to know I'm just one false step, just one moment off balance, one wrong turn from complete disaster, and my days of independence and mobility are over. Teach us to number our days, says the psalmist, that we may go into the gate of wisdom. The person who knows that our days are limited, that our lives do not go on forever, that all of life's dead ends and setbacks and disappointments are dress rehearsals for the last breath, the last day. Oh, this is wisdom. Teach us that our days are numbered so that we might wise up to life's fragility. This is the way we walk. This is the journey with death toward death. This journey toward death we call life. And yet, we are walking with Jesus, the resurrected Christ. So, hey people, hold on to your hats. This may be a surprising trip. This Sunday, we walk with Jesus into the town of Nain. Now, by this time, Jesus has attracted a crowd that moves with him as he moves. And because of Luke's gospel, we are able to be part of Jesus' entourage. As Jesus enters town, there, standing at the gate, we notice a dead man is being carried out. Now, last Sunday, it was Jesus ministering to the sick. Now things have gotten a lot worse. Sickness, experienced by most of us as a taste of death, a prelude for dying, well, it's become death. Death is taken over this whole town. Jesus' crowd, arriving at Nain, runs into death's crowd, coming out, grieving out of Nain. And though Jesus has compassion for a sad, grieving mother, he orders her, don't weep. Which certainly doesn't sound that compassionate. I mean, you don't tell grieving people, hey, don't cry. You don't order them around. Jesus' command to this poor grieving widow is surprising. But isn't that the way it often is when you journey with Jesus? All along the way, he shocks, he surprises, he challenges our way of thinking. He disrupts our expectations. He makes our lives more surprising than they would have been if we hadn't been walking with Jesus. Everything changes except death and taxes, says that old slogan. And yet, after Easter, we don't walk alone. Jesus walks with us. He leads us down surprising paths that enable us to say, everything changes except taxes. Into this believable, dusty little town, you've heard of Nain before. Jesus takes us there into these towns with their ordinary death and their usual grief. It's typically worried mothers. It's children without a future. That's where Jesus enters. And when Jesus comes to town, surprise, he commands even a grieving mother in his compassion for her. He commands her to take charge of her feelings, to stand up and defy even death, to be a victor rather than victim. Even more surprising, Jesus even commands the dead, arise. And the dead do just that. Now, one might have thought that Luke, ever the competent dramatist, would have saved a resurrection wonder like the raising of this widow's son for a more appropriate time, later in his account of Jesus, at a more impressive location, maybe like up at the Holy City, perhaps sometime appropriately after Easter. No, Luke tells this surprising Easter story here, near the beginning, a while before Easter, in an out-of-the-way village nobody ever heard of, among anonymous ordinary folk caught in the grip of ordinary everyday death. It's as if Luke says, what the modern world teaches as extraordinary, miraculous, supernatural, that's just another day on the road when you're with Jesus. Because now, once Jesus intrudes among us, God can surprise us anytime God pleases, pushing into new, previously off-limits territory that death thinks he owns. I love the way that Luke reports this miraculous resuscitation at Nain, as if this is ordinary, to be expected, just a momentary diversion in Jesus' journey. In the Catholic Church, for somebody to be named a saint, there's an investigation. The miracles must be attributed to the work of the candidate for sainthood. Note, no names are given for the grieving widow of Nain or for her dead son. And maybe that's Luke's way of saying, hey, we don't remember their names because, well, this sort of thing happened all the time on the road with Jesus. Maybe we're meant to hear this story as what one might expect to happen in an ordinary little town like ours on an ordinary Sunday in June to anonymous people like most of us. Before we're done with this story, or should I say before this story is done with us, note the reaction of the citizens of Nain. A young man has been brought back to life. A widow has been given a gracious reprieve from her otherwise dead end. The folks at Nain received the miracle with a curious mix of fear and glorification. Glory is understandable in response to a mighty work of God like this one, a dramatic defeat of death. And yet, there's also fear, because it's more than a little frightening to experience firsthand the incursion of a living, surprising God who can kick through the barricades of death. Sometimes the surprising work of Jesus among us is glorious, and sometimes scary, and sometimes it's a bit of both. We don't know how to explain such scary, glorious moments when that which we thought was a dead end isn't the end after all, where a way is made when we thought there was no way. Some of the folks at Nain thought that they'd found a great prophet among them. Others exclaimed, God has looked favorably on his people. And in a way, they were all correct. It was a glorious moment, and scary too. Scary to come face to face with a living God who will not let death be the last word, who will not let death rule. Jesus is a great prophet who tells us and shows us the truth about our true situation with life and death. But above all this little story is a parable of a great, grand Easter truth. In Jesus Christ, in his walking with us, even into the jaws of death, in his defeat of death, God has indeed looked favorably on God's people. Oh, he is risen. He is risen indeed.